You like catching them all? Okay, so the latest trailer for Legends AZ dropped, and we finally got the starters revealed. Immediately I knew I wanted to do something themed around the starters, and seeing how I have this leftover Pokémon dice mold from project my sister wanted, I knew what had to be done. All the models used were just free ones on codes that I resin printed. How I paint is exactly the same for all three of these, so let's look at Tepig because I found them the most complicated and involved. I normally do this with my airbrush, but my airbrush is a bastard. I tried using it while painting Totodile, clogged just before covering it enough to, be good or usable, and cut my thumb while I was trying to clean it. So no airbrush in this video, which means I get to build up a coat of orange, which isn't fun. You paint, you make sure it's nice and thin so you can't see any brush marks, which was over 10 different coats, building up a nice vibrant orange. That's over 5 hours of just waiting for the paint to dry. And look, my paint is cheap, so maybe it's just bad. This might be my fault for getting the wrong tool for the wrong job. But I did it and now we have a nice orange base. It's not perfect, but you can get away with a lot of stuff when a painted model is inside of a dice. Because of all the angles and how the light is diffused, it hides quite a few mistakes. We started with the lightest colour because the light colours don't cover up dark colours as well as dark colours cover up light colour. The darker colours luckily only take 2 or 3 coats to get a nice even finish. To get the darker colour of Tepig, I actually decided to mix up brown and black. The reference pictures of Tepig I'm looking at all look like they have a slight hint of brown to them. Once I've mixed up my brown, I scoop the majority of it into a pot. Because I'm mixing colours, I really don't want to have to remix up the colours later, because colour matching is hard, and if I just leave the paint out, it will dry up and be usable? Usable. And it will be no good. Next is what they're going on. I like how dice with a base look when it comes to these little thingy in a bottle dice, so I came up with a plan. Tepig, a fire type, would be standing on a rock with a little volcanic vent next to him. Chikorita obviously would be in a grassy field of some kind, maybe a flower or two. I was kind of making that one up as I went along, a mini diorama-ish kind of base. Now obviously Totodile's base should be water, but he can't just stand on the water. I briefly considered making a model of him swimming, so the top part of him showing out of the water, but even if I could find a model that looked like he was swimming, the way I do water and dice, it will cover up too much of our little blue boy. A friend suggested I put a rock sticking out of the water, which I like, he is a crocodile, but I've already done a rock. So I decided on a lily pad instead. Okay, plans are in place, and starting with Tepig, I put a few dabs of red mica at the bottom of the die. I did this to break up all the grey that was about to happen, but it ended up giving me some inspiration. More on that a little later. I pour a small amount of shiny grey resin. I wanted this to be reminiscent of a rock, but not look overly realistic. More conveying the feeling of rock than looking like a rock, After that was hardened, I took the base out of the mold. I had FTM printed my rock and the volcanic vent, so I began to paint them up. I wanted a black wash for the main rock Tepig was going to be standing on, and here's where we get into our comedy of errors. Firstly, I take a cup that had some dried paint in it from Totodile. Now, to be honest, this cup was a little bit small. It was all I had while painting up the Totodile, and I'm using this cup because I was hoping the water would gain a blue tint to it from the leftover blue paint that had dried inside of the cup. This really didn't end up happening, but that's fine. I was hoping for a blue tint, but I didn't need a blue tint. Next I tried to add some black paint to the wash, but I ran out. Drat. A long, arduous trip to my supply cupboard all the way downstairs later, and I return with my other bottle of black paint. I began mixing the black and water, mixing quite vigorously to try and get some of that blue pigment in my wash, and I managed to splash it on myself. Not to worry, I'll just put the brush down and grab some tissue. God damn it. Putting the tissue down to stop it spilling everywhere, I decided at this point, screw it, and then just scraped the wash off my desk and onto the rock. Which, to my shock, actually worked. While that dried, I just covered the volcanic vent in the same dark brown on Tepig. It's different from the main rock, and the main attraction of this is going to be the smoke coming out of it. Back to rock. Now it's dried, I'm going to be adding some detail. A rough edge highlight, Stippling some brown onto it. Too much brown, so I add some more grey, a tiny hint of green, managing to break off the toothpick what I was using to hold it. A second edge highlight. Finally, the rock is done. I stick another toothpick in the middle of the volcanic vent and coat it in glue and wrap some cotton wool around it. After the glue dries, I spray some grey primer on it. And look at the combined result. I'm actually quite proud of this. Remember, this is a tiny scale. He looks really good on his base. Man, after putting this much effort, I'd sure hate if anything went wrong. Because the smoke effect's made out of cotton wool, I am worried about it absorbing a bunch of resin and causing a void. I'm not worried about creating bubbles. Don't get me wrong, I'm expecting it to make a bunch of bubbles, but I actually think that will add to the effect. So, the plan was to mostly fill the mold and let it sit for at least 12 hours, then finish off the dice. So if the cotton did absorb a bunch of resin, it wouldn't be a problem. Sure, it'll add another 12 hours to this project that's supposed to be timely, but I really don't want everything to go wrong. I line the base up so that it's the right orientation for when it goes into the mold. Next, I degas the resin, pour a small amount in the bottom. This way, if I can't get the base flush to the bottom, I'm not stuck with bubbles or voids or a massive gap. Okay, it's time. We go to put the base in the mold. Volcanic vent popped off. Okay, that's bad, but not disastrous. So I remove it for now. I'm going to push the base in the mold, and Tepig's tail snapped off. That's disastrous. I take the base out now, which is completely covered in resin. Shit. I'm now in full panic mode. If the resin sets, the base won't go back into the mold properly. So I'm now on the clock to fix Tepig before the resin becomes unworkable. For those who don't know, unworkable basically means the resin becomes too thick to work with. Sure, I can still move the resin around at this point, but it becomes so viscous that it won't form into the mold properly, and even if it does, it's taking on bubbles so badly. Now, normally my resin has a 40-minute work time. It's wait, 40 minutes to work, right? Wrong. One, this resin's been in a hot bath. This makes the resin runnier, which is important for getting into all the gaps and crevices in something like this, and it helps get rid of bubbles. Great. But it also speeds up the reaction of a resin hardening, so I have less than 40 minutes. How much less? I don't know. But I did degas the resin for over 5 minutes already, so I have an unspecified amount of time to fix this mess, and I've already used over 5 minutes of it. I used UV resin to reattach the volcanic vent. That was easy, but the ball on the end of Tepig's tail was not. It was already covered in resin, so attaching it back on was really difficult, because the UV resin I was trying to use to stick the ball back on was only sticking to the resin, not the tail, and the resin was liquid. But finally, I got it done. Quickly, I put the base back into the mold. I grabbed whatever wouldn't stick nearby. I had to try and push the base into the bottom, but it's just not fitting properly. I try again and again to get it lined up, and the tail once again falls off. It's been over 20 minutes at this point, and the resin's getting thick, so I called it. I take the broken Tepig out of the mold, pour the leftover resin into the mold, so I clean up the mold, and leave it all to set overnight. Next morning shows the damage. Base is covered in excess resin, which means it won't fit into the mold. So the plan: stick the tail back on, and with UV resin. Now that it's set, that's easy. But then I do what I should have done to begin with. I cover the tail in said UV resin to make sure it never breaks off again. The UV resin is clear, so this will be invisible in the actual mold, and it makes it so much thicker. If you have any thin parts on anything you're doing like this, cover everything you can in UV resin. It'll just make it one solid piece, and you won't have to deal with what I just dealt with. I just take a super rough piece of sandpaper and remove a ton of material. You can't even see the numbers on the base anymore. I don't polish it because the resin of the dice will basically do that for me. It'll now fit into the mold again, and the clear resin will fill in the gaps I've now created and recreate the numbers and all the lost detail. The tail is far too sturdy to be knocked off at this point, and I'm confident nothing will go wrong. I pour some resin in the bottom of the mold again, add the base, Begin gently pushing it into the bottom so it's flush, and an ear breaks off. It's happening. Again. Luckily, this is nowhere as near big of an issue as the tail. Being at the top of the dice is perfect. Remember how I'm planning on mostly filling up this mold to let the cotton absorb all the resin I can? Well, now we just need to fill up only to the head, so I have plenty of room left to redo the ears. The ear that was left was too tall, so I ended up breaking that off on purpose and re-angling both, so they look coherent and fit into the mold. 12 hours later, I reattach the ears and add the final resin pour. Finally, we're done with Tepig. Next is Totodile, and honestly there's nothing interesting to say. Feature just base, put the dial on the pad, and the pad on the base. Clear resin, done. I didn't even record me doing it. Don't get me wrong, I love doing this dice, and he turned out so good. But he was absolutely the simplest one to do. But I did also add a dab of blue mica. After seeing how it looked on the Tepig dice, I thought it would be fun to have the type colour of each starter of the D20 on the bottom, and I'm sure nothing went wrong with this idea. Oh, is that the doorbell? Oh, I have a letter. Moving on to the Chikorita, I mix up some resin adding green and copper pigments to give it an earthy vibe. Next I add some dirt resin. I pour this into the mould, and once the base is poured, I sprinkle more dirt into the mould. After taking it out, I cover the surface in glue and sprinkle yet more dirt onto the surface. Once it's dried, I put a small clump of static grass and a flower piece onto the base. It's mostly foliage at this point, but you can see some of the dirt, which I like. It feels like a field and not just a bunch of grass, you know? I did consider adding some fake foliage. I do have some, but I thought that would just obscure Chikorita too much. Again, the Pokemon are the main point of the dice. The bases are just a little bit of fun. They're there to highlight the Pokemon, not be the main show. Now I have all the dice out of the molds, there are one or two issues to fix. Little bubbles like this, I'm not concerned, but big voids like this, I want to fix. So I use a toothpick and gently spread some UV resin in all the gaps. And while inking the numbers, I noticed something. The bottom of Tepig, it's not red. The original pour had red mica powder in it that I completely sanded off. And when I went to re-pour it, I forgot to put any red mica in. That wonderful effect I said I liked so much that I recreated it on the other two, yeah, it's gone. Honestly, this is not so bad that I felt I had to redo the entire dice, but I really like that effect, and I'm really sad I forgot. After all the voids were filled, dice are polished, and it's inked, we're on to the beauty shots.